Welcome to today's webinar, The Role of Nutrition in Multiple Sclerosis. Your presenter is Dr. Lucinda Black, and I'm your facilitator, Nicola Graham. So I'd like to very warmly welcome our presenter today, Dr. Lucinda Black, and just a little bit of information about Lucinda. Lucinda is a nutritional epidemiologist with a particular interest in vitamin D, diet, and risk of onset and progression of multiple sclerosis. Lucinda completed a PhD in nutritional sciences in 2012 at the University College Cork in Ireland, where she investigated dietary vitamin D and population vitamin D deficiency. Lucinda is a senior research fellow at the School of Public Health, Curtin University. She's the recipient of 2 successive fellowships, an MSWA postdoc fellowship and the MSRA postdoc fellowship to investigate diet and MS. Lucinda maintains a strong engagement with the MS community in WA and gives regular community talks on diet and MS. And this is such an interesting subject, and we're all very keen to hear the subject matter today. So I just want to indicate that this presentation has been prepared and is presented by an independent expert. And I'm now going to hand over to Lucinda, which means I'm going to change the control panel and just let Lucinda start on her slides. So thank you, Lucinda. Over to you in Perth.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So thank you all for joining the webinar. And thank you, Nicola, for that very lovely introduction. So this is really going to be a crash course in diet and MS. I'm going to start with diet and risk of MS. So this is important for people who are at high risk of MS but don't already have MS. So the information I present in that section, it might not be relevant to people who already have MS. Then I'm going to go on and talk about dietary changes that people with MS make once they're diagnosed. We know that a lot of people do make dietary changes. I'll talk about the special diets for MS because they're of great interest to people with MS. Then I'll talk about the evidence around diet and disease progression. And I've included symptom management in that section because depression and fatigue are often used as outcome measures in those studies. So then I'll talk, based on the evidence, I'll talk about what are the best available recommendations we have now, and they're the things that you can talk to people with MS about if they ask you about diet. And I'll give you a brief summary and some information about what's going on now in the field. So I'm going to talk about risk of MS, partly because I've been working on this myself for the last few years as part of my MSWA postdoc fellowship. So I've been using 2 studies, one Australian and one American, and these studies are very similar in design. The autoimmune study, the Australian one, came first, and they recruited nearly 300 people who had an FCD. Now that's a first clinical diagnosis of central nervous system demyelination. So it's before people would be diagnosed with MS. Now most people who do have an FCD, they do go on to get MS, but they don't yet have MS when they were recruited in this study. So the research team also recruited nearly 600 control participants who had no FCD, so they were healthy controls. And although the study wasn't designed to look specifically at diet, they did collect a very good food frequency questionnaire. So we have a lot of information about the diet of those participants in the year before they had an FCD. Now, the second study is from America. It was run a little later than the autoimmune study, and it was based on very similar methods, some co-investigators working on the 2 studies. And the main difference here is that it was a multi-ethnic population, whereas the autoimmune study was mainly Caucasian. Now, they didn't collect a full food frequency questionnaire in this study, but we do have data on fish consumption and early life diet. Although I'm not going to be talking about early life diet in this talk because I haven't analysed those data yet. So the first thing I looked at in these studies is overall dietary patterns. So dietary patterns have been associated with other chronic diseases, and there are a couple of papers on dietary patterns and MS. So both of the studies mentioned there, references 3 and 4, are from Iran. And one of them found that a higher Western pattern was associated with increased risk of MS. The other found that a Mediterranean type diet was linked with lower risk of MS. So I was able to do something similar in the Autoimmune study, and I used principal component analysis, which is quite a complicated statistical technique, but basically it looks for patterns in what people are reading, and then it can give people scores on those certain patterns, so from low to high. So what I found was some nice results came out in terms of the dietary patterns that people were reading in that population. So there were 2 main patterns, a Western and a healthy, and you can see there the types of foods that were loading high and low on those patterns, pretty typical of what we would consider a Western and healthy pattern. So what I found was there was no link actually between a Western dietary pattern and risk of FCD. So it didn't matter where you sat on the Western pattern. But what was important was where you sat on the healthy pattern. So the people who had more of those healthy foods had quite a substantially reduced risk of FCD, so around 50%. So I've put all the stats in the bottom box there, the odds ratios and whatnot, if you are interested. But the takeaway message is that really there could be something going on here with diet and risk of MS. And this was published last year in Multiple Sclerosis. So I started thinking then, well, what about specific foods? Like what might be important in that healthy dietary pattern? And we know that oily fish is high in vitamin D and high in omega-3, both of which may be linked to risk of MS and even disease progression. There's one study, a case control study that looked at oily fish and lower risk and risk of MS. They found a lower risk of MS for those who ate fish at least once a week. The authors thought that it might be due to the vitamin D content in the oily fish. Also, from the Autoimmune study, before I started working on it, the research team looked at omega-3 fatty acids and found that higher intake was linked with lower risk of FCD. So I was able to look at fish in both the Autoimmune and MS Sunshine study. And really interesting is that we found very similar results, even though these are totally different populations, different groups of people, different types of people in these studies. So in the Autoimmune study, overall fish intake was linked with lower risk of FCD, but it was mainly from tinned fish. Now, tinned fish we think is generally oily. Most people would eat tinned fish as tuna, salmon, mackerel, sardines, for example, and they're all oily types of fish. We found no link between grilled and fried fish and risk of FCD. And grilled and fried fish, you'd imagine, might include some white fish, particularly the fried fish. Often that's when people go to get fish and chips from the chipper, for example. So there was no link there with risk of FCD. And in the MS Sunshine study, very similar, consuming fish at least once a week was linked with lower risk of FCD. So around 40 to 50% lower risk of FCD. And that's only with fish consumption a couple of times a week. So we're not talking about massive amounts. Now that's unpublished. The MS Sunshine study paper is submitted. The Autoimmune study, not yet. I just haven't had time to submit it yet. So they are not peer reviewed yet, just so you know. They're preliminary results. So then I thought, well, what about red meat? Because there's some information from the literature around processed meat and increased risk of MS from various types of studies. So again, I was able to look at this in the Autoimmune study. And what I did was I separated the unprocessed red meat and the processed red meat. The reason being that they're very different types of foods. So unprocessed red meat is actually quite high in lots of important nutrients and important nutrients even for brain health, whereas processed red meat, not so much of the good nutrients and potentially some toxic or deleterious nutrients in those. So what I found was there was no link between the processed meat intake and risk of FCD, but very interestingly, a higher consumption of unprocessed red meat was linked with reduced risk of FCD. Now we found that in the total population and in women, but not in men. So there's a few reasons why we might not have seen it in men. One is that we had far fewer men in the study, and that's simply because MS is more common in women, so we had about 3 times as many women. The second reason could be that the men in the study were eating quite a lot of red meat, so there was no one really at the lower end. So because of that, you don't necessarily see what would happen if we had men with lower intakes. If we did, we may have seen something similar. And the other reason is that there might actually be sex differences in the relationship between the unprocessed red meat and FCD. One thing that's been suggested is that iron intake might be important for reducing risk of MS. Iron is actually important for the synthesis of myelin, it's important in the brain, it's important for brain health. We know that unprocessed red meat is high in heme iron, which is very bioavailable, and women have higher requirements for iron than men, so it could be that. But it's speculation really at this stage, and this study certainly doesn't tell us what part of the unprocessed red meat is important. So the stats are at the bottom, but they're quite complicated because of the way we did the analysis. We did it as an energy density. So I've tried to clarify what that means in terms of a typical adult female diet. The reduced risk is around 1 daily serve of unprocessed red meat, linking to a 26% reduced risk of FCD. So quite a big reduction again in this analysis. Now, 1 serve is actually quite small. It's 65 grams of cooked red meat, which is 100 grams raw. So we're not saying this is like having a steak a day. You know, a typical steak would be more than 200 grams possibly raw. So what we're suggesting is around 450 grams a week, which is just under the upper limit suggested by the Australian Dietary Guidelines, which is 500 grams a week. And the Australian Dietary Guidelines has chosen that limit, 500 grams a week, because above that, that's when you start seeing possible negative outcomes with other chronic diseases. So that was also published last year. And then, so I thought, well, what about red meat in a healthy diet? If you have a healthy pattern and you include the non-processed red meat. So I looked at the Mediterranean diet in the Ozimune study. And there's a very common score called the alternate Mediterranean diet score, used in lots of studies of various chronic diseases. So I applied that to the Ozimune data, but then I modified it to allow the diet to have 1 serve daily of unprocessed red meat. So the typical AMED score is low in meat. The one I've created has 1 serve a day of unprocessed red meat, along with all those other healthy things listed there. So both scores are from 0 to 9, 9 being the better adherence to the diet. And I categorize those into 4 to make the analysis easier and make more sense. So what I found, again, I think this is really interesting, is that with the Mediterranean diet itself, there was no link with risk of FCD. But once you added the unprocessed red meat, 1 daily serve, you're looking at a really substantial reduction of risk of FCD. So if you look at the graph, everything below 1 signifies a reduced risk. So everyone in the categories above 1 had a reduced risk. It wasn't a linear association, and that suggests that you don't have to be extreme with this diet. Actually, people in category 3, so not the actual people who are in the extreme top end, but people in category 3 had the most reduced risk. But overall, it shows that being in category 1 is not ideal. You want to be slightly higher than that. So although it says unpublished there, this was actually accepted yesterday into the Journal of Nutrition. So that's exciting, and that should be published soon. Okay, so I mean, what I can say so far about reduced risk of FCD, based on the Ozimune study and a little bit from the MS Sunshine study, is that there really does seem to be a link between diet and risk of FCD. So we're talking about a healthy pattern being important, higher oily fish and omega-3, higher unprocessed red meat, and, you know, ideally part of a healthy diet like the Mediterranean diet. And all these findings are in line with the Australian Dietary Guidelines. That doesn't sound very exciting, but only around 4% of the population follow the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So most people could really be doing a lot more to bring their diet in line with those. And for many people, to start eating in line with the Australian dietary guidelines would be quite a radical change to their diet. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of risk. And I'm going to move on to talk about dietary changes. So now we're moving on to talk about people who already have MS.
Lucinda, can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
So we've got a question here from Jane, and she's asking about the link of red meat and bowel cancer. So are the recommendations 65 grams, is that in line with bowel cancer recommendations also?
Yes, it would be. So, I mean, the Australian dietary guidelines with the 500 gram upper limit has been derived from the literature in terms of those chronic diseases, including bowel cancer. And there's some research, I mean, it's not my field, but there's some research now showing that processed meat is really the problem for bowel cancer, maybe not so much the unprocessed red meat. But and there's some studies that actually do show a protective effect of red meat, only very few though. But I would say importantly is we need to avoid processed red meat.
Great, thank you, Lucinda.
Okay. So dietary changes. I ran this Google search last year just out of interest, looking for diet to cure MS, and there were more than 16 million hits. So this was overwhelming, even for me as a nutritionist. And this is the kind of information I found on the first page. And if you look at the kinds of words being used here, you know, cured, reverses, avoid, dangers, someone saying a gluten-free diet is recommended, someone saying they think that sugar led to their MS. These are very emotive words. And I can imagine that for someone with MS who's already very stressed out, they've just been diagnosed with MS, this is quite scary stuff to see. And certainly if a dietitian sat down with someone with MS, they wouldn't use these kinds of words. And some of these articles, they're not necessarily backed up by scientific evidence, and they're conflicting, so it's very confusing for people. And unfortunately, there isn't really any authoritative dietary guidelines for people with MS yet. But we do know that around 40% of people with MS do change their diet. This is from the Autoimmune study and other studies, including overseas studies. And this is an example of some of the changes being made by people who were in the Autoimmune study. So they don't add up to 100% because people were allowed to choose more than one. But there's lots of good changes happening, like increased fruit and veg, reduced discretionary foods, increased fish, that kind of thing. But what I want to point out here is the other category at the bottom. So 82% of people said they did something that was basically not done by many other people. So by fewer than 5 people, actually. And this is just a small example of the types of changes being made. And there were more like 80 or 90. The list was very long. But if you look at this, I mean, there's things here like someone increased nuts, someone reduced nuts, someone increased tea and coffee, someone reduced it. People were eliminating things like white bread, acidic foods, soy. People started skipping meals, stopped skipping meals. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's no consistency in the type of changes people are making when they are diagnosed with MS. So it suggests that people are confused about what they should be doing. So Rebecca Russell, who is now a PhD student here, she did her honours on a topic where she interviewed people who were recently diagnosed with MS and asked them about their attitudes towards diet. And fairly consistently, she found that the people were saying there was a lack of advice given to them about diet. They went about looking for their own information, largely online, that some of them were following the special diets, and they were pretty frustrated about the lack of evidence. So these are some of the quotes that were coming up. So someone here said, you know, all she was told was to have a healthy diet, but she's like, well, what is that? Someone else said, well, they just were overwhelmed. They really wanted to research everything about diet to find out what was going on. Someone else was following a paleo type diet, and she was quite stressed out because she couldn't go out and socialize and eat because she couldn't find the foods that fitted her diet. So overall, there seemed to be quite a lot of stress from people around diet. And in 2012, there was a report published by MS Research Australia and Deakin. It was a needs analysis of people with MS, showing that dietetics was a high priority. People didn't feel like they were getting the support, the dietetic support that they wanted. So it's obviously very important to people with MS. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the special diets, and I'm not an expert in these special diets, but I'm going to give you an overview of what they are. So when people bring them up, you have an idea about what kind of diet they're talking about. And I'm going to hand over to Nicola, and she's going to run the first poll. So I'm interested in what special diets you've heard of. And I know you've seen the handouts probably already, so if you can answer as if you hadn't seen the handouts about what diets you'd heard of. Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Lucinda. So yes, if you could please tick all of the following that apply. What special MS diets have you heard of? Swank, Overcoming MS or the gel neck diet, McDougall, the Walls Paleo, or others. And that's fantastic. I can see that over 50% of you have already voted, which is great. We can't see who's voting for what, so be ambitious. There's we can't identify who's given right or wrong answer. In this case, there is no right or wrong answer. So there's still a few more people to vote. If you could cast your vote, that would be great. And then we'll close the polling in a moment. So, okay, that's fantastic. If we could just now close the poll, you'll be able to see the results. We'll share those results with you. Fantastic. You can see, and Lucinda, I'm hoping that you can perhaps see these results as well.
I can't, unfortunately, but you can tell me.
I'll tell you. 31% of people had heard of Swank. 69% of people have heard of Overcoming MS or gel neck.
How many, sorry?
69, nearly 70. Yeah.
Wow.
13% McDougall. And again, interestingly, 69% of people have heard of the Walls Paleo and 19% other.
Some people said other as well, did they?
Yeah, 19%. So if you want to type in other, which diets they were, I can also let Lucinda know that as well. So if you want to type in other diets you've heard of that are related to MS, please pop that in the question panel. So we'll hide that now, and it's back to your slides, Lucinda.
Thanks, Nicola. Okay, that's interesting, because I expected everybody to have heard of the Swank diet, but only because it's been around for so long. I'm not surprised, though, that lots of people have heard of the Overcoming MS, because it is an Australian diet. And Walls, too, is very popular. And I'm going to talk about these in a minute, because those two are quite different diets. Not many have heard of the McDougall diet. It's actually a vegan-type diet. And yeah, I'd be interested in knowing what other diets people have heard of, because there are certainly more, and some of them probably I haven't heard of either. So you can let me know at the end of this section, maybe, Nicola. So I'm going to talk about these four main diets, and I will say again, I'm not an expert in them. I haven't read the books. I probably should read the books, but I haven't read them at this stage. But I'm going to give you an overview about what the diets are. So the Swank diet is essentially a low saturated fat diet, and it's got lots of good things in it: fruit, veg, whole grains, all those good things there on the left, and restrictive of processed foods, which is great. The Swank diet also restricts full fat dairy, pretty restrictive on red meat and egg yolk. Interestingly though, this diet is from the website, but the original Swank diet was quite different. So back in the 1950s, Swank looked at regions in Norway, and he noticed that there was more MS in places where animal fat was higher and lower MS in coastal regions where people ate fish. So he then developed this diet, and he followed people for more than 30 years. So people with MS who were on this diet, and he essentially found that people who were eating less than 15 grams of saturated fat a day had better outcomes in this study. But his original diet was quite different, though. If you look back in the literature, so for one thing is that he encouraged his patients to have at least one egg a day, and that includes the egg yolk, whereas now the egg yolk is restricted. Also, he was very enthusiastic about low-fat milk as a source of protein. The other thing is that he didn't put any restrictions on red meats. So the restriction actually was on what he called hard fat. So he allowed 3 teaspoons of hard fat a day, where 1 teaspoon is 1 serve of red meat, or a sausage, or 3 slices of bacon, and various other types of foods. So you can see that actually on the swank diet, you could eat a good bit of red meat. What he did forbid was all these things that have appeared now on your screen. So he was quite adamant about whole milk being restricted, but also look at all that list of processed and discretionary foods there that were forbidden. I mean, pastries, pies, cakes, cookies, donuts, ice cream, lots of things that we love to eat. And interestingly, that food group, essentially cereal and cereal-based dishes, which is anything made from wheat like pasta and pastries and all that, that food group is the biggest contributor to saturated fat intake in the population now. So just by cutting out those foods, you're going to really reduce your saturated fat intake. So that's the swank diet. And the Overcoming MS diet is really based on the swank diet. So lots of similarities, lots of good foods in it, restrictive of the processed foods, similar to the swank diet. But in this case, no dairy is allowed, no meat, similarly no egg yolk is allowed. So it's a little more restrictive than the swank diet. The McDougall diet, as I mentioned, is vegan. It's very low saturated fat, so all the things you'd expect in terms of no animal products, and it's very high in the veggies, the whole grains, and the fruit. And the Walls diet is based on a paleo diet. It's essentially a modified paleo diet. She's changed it to suit her specific diet. And there's lots of levels of the diet. You know, there's level 1, 2, 3. So on each level, it might be more or less restrictive of certain things. But overall, it's very high in veggies, high in fruit, no restriction per se on animal protein, high in fish. No gluten, so that cuts out all your kind of wheat-based pastries and whatnot. No dairy, no eggs, and various other restrictions, depending on the level as well. So I think it's quite nice to see those all in a table like this, and along the bottom is the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So if you look at the front of the table, veggies and fruit, everybody's saying we need to eat more of those. All the special diets are saying that. And if you look at the back of the table, all the diets are saying no processed food. So really, if people just change their diets in line with those, they're going to make a big difference to their overall health and well-being. There's no doubt about that. And certainly people who are on these special diets frequently report they feel better when they're on the diet. So in the middle, you can see there's lots of various restrictions according to what diet people want to follow. The most permissive is the Australian Dietary Guidelines. The others are more restrictive. But we don't know for sure whether restricting those foods is necessary. That's really the main thing, because it's quite stressful for people to restrict something in their diet. So we do want to have the evidence about that. Okay, so before we move on to the evidence, and now we've had a bit of a chat about the diets, I'll hand over to Nicola for the second poll, just about whether you know anyone with MS who's following a special diet. Thanks, Nicola.
Okay, so do you know anyone who has MS who has modified their diet and are following a special diet? And your options are to select one of the following: no one, a couple of people, 3 or more people. And the attendees are straight onto it, and nearly 70% of people have voted already, so that's fantastic. We'll just give a few moments longer with a few more people vote. Okay, that's great. A couple more seconds and then we'll close the voting. Okay, we'll close now. 80% of people have voted, and we'll share those results. And what we can see is that 33% of attendees do not know anybody who modified their diet. 7% of people know one person. 20% know a couple of people, and 40% of attendees know 3 or more people who have changed their diet.
Wow, thanks, Nicola. So that is interesting. I didn't expect it to be so high, actually. So lots of people know 3 or more people who are following a special diet. That's interesting. But some of you don't know anyone who's following a special diet. In my experience, when I give talks to people who have MS, I get lots of questions from the people who are following a special diet, but I don't really hear from the people who aren't. So in my world, lots of people are following the special diets. Whereas in the autoimmune study, which I showed earlier, which was 10 years ago, we hardly had anybody following a special diet then. So I think they have become more popular now.
And Lucinda, I've got a few questions if you're happy to answer a few at the moment.
Now's a good time, yeah.
Okay, great. So we've got Sharon's asked, what's the rationale re no dairy?
Okay, so that's probably where I need to read the books, to be honest, because what I understand is that there's certain proteins in dairy that the creators of these diets thinks you shouldn't be getting in terms of disease progression in MS. But I don't know the details, to be honest. Okay. But I think it's to do with a protein and the blood-brain barrier. So the people who created the diets are worried about certain compounds getting across the blood-brain barrier and causing havoc in the brain, essentially. And they think it's coming from dairy and meat in some cases, that kind of thing.
Okay, great. And what are your thoughts? This is a question from James. What are your thoughts regarding organ meat? It's not a popular choice these days.
Okay, so yeah, that's interesting. But one of the comments that Rebecca got in her study, actually, from someone who was on the paleo diet, she just said it was a nightmare cooking the organ meats because her family absolutely hated the smell. So she really was quite stressed about having to cook the organ meats. She didn't want to have to eat them. But I have to say, organ meats are very, very nutritious. So they're really high in vitamin A and vitamin D and lots of other nutrients like the B vitamins that are important. But I think you need to be careful with organ meats that you're selecting organic organ meats. And the reason I say that is, for example, if you eat liver is what processes the toxins in your body. So it's the same for the cow or the animal with the liver. That's where they process the toxins. So any toxins going into that animal are going to be in the liver. So it's important to choose organic when you're choosing organ meat. That's what I would say. But I do think they're very nutritious.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lucinda.
Okay, so now I'm going to get into the evidence around disease progression, and some of them, as I mentioned, will be symptom management because they've looked at fatigue and depression as outcomes. So I'm going to talk mostly about systematic reviews because there have been a few, and they're a good way of seeing a summary of all the evidence that's been collected so far in that field. And they're essentially considered, at the top of the hierarchy of evidence, particularly the systematic reviews that look only at randomized controlled trials. So I'll talk about those. I'll talk about some randomized controlled trials that weren't included in the systematic reviews for various reasons. And then I'll talk about one systematic review that included observational studies. But I'm not going to talk about all the information from the various observational studies because they're mainly included in that systematic review. So it's quite interesting because in 2012, there was a systematic review published in the Cochrane Library. Now that is the best journal for systematic reviews, really rigorous, very high quality. And the question of this systematic review was, can changes in diet be effective for people with MS? And they looked for all the controlled trials on any kind of diet or supplementation except for vitamin D. And amazingly, they only found 6 trials that fit the selection criteria, and they were all on polyunsaturated fatty acids. So they were omega-3 and sometimes omega-6. But what's really interesting is that 4 of those studies were from the 1970s. So really old studies, one from 1989 and one from 2005. So it was kind of evidence that there hadn't been a lot of research in this area. what they found from those studies was that there was no effect on disease progression, maybe some benefits for relapse from these supplements, and that was from omega-6 particularly. But overall, the trial quality was poor, and that's not surprising given that 4 of them were from the 1970s, because we have a lot stricter criteria now on trials. So ultimately, the conclusion of that was that we really need more research. So I'm going to talk now about some RCTs that have been conducted since then, because it looks like really this field has taken off since that systematic review was published in terms of the research. So there have been a number of omega-3 supplement trials, possibly more than this. I'm just showing you results from 3 here. Basically, the top one there, they found no effect on relapse or lesions. The next one, similar, except they did see a benefit for pro-inflammatory cytokines. They were reduced, which is important for people with MS. And the third one there looked at depression as an outcome, found no effect of the supplements. Actually, in that study, the control group and the intervention group equally improved. So the authors thought it might be the placebo effect. So people didn't know what supplement they were getting. Some were getting omega-3, some were getting a sugar pill, essentially. And everybody improved. Everyone got better over the 3 months. So no evidence that the omega-3 particularly worked. But you can see from the numbers of people in those trials, they're very low, especially when you consider that they're randomized to 2 groups. So you have, in that last study, you only had around 15 people per group, very small. So I did have an extra column here on this table for limitations, but they were the same for all of them, so I got rid of it, because basically the limitations of all these studies, the authors have said they didn't really have enough people. That means there's low study power, so you can't detect small changes in things like relapse rate or lesions. So really they're pilot studies, and there is some positive suggestion there of an effect on pro-inflammatory cytokines, and certainly worthy of looking at in a bigger trial. And there have been various other studies on other supplements since 2012. The top 2 are CoQ10 and lipoic acid there. They're both antioxidants. And the first one there found improved fatigue and depression, improvement in inflammatory markers. The second one the same, improvement in inflammatory markers. So again, small numbers, but it does hint at something maybe beneficial going on. They were also quite short trials. So at the moment, there's a much bigger trial happening in Australia that's looking at supplementation of antioxidants in people with MS, looking at fatigue and disease activity. And the supplements include CoQ10 and lipoic acid and other antioxidants. So it'll be interesting to see the results of that over the next few years. Other studies have been done, like riboflavin, that's B2. No effect was found, but again, small numbers. Probiotics did see improvement in disability and depression and other markers, and certainly the gut microbiome is of great interest now in relation to MS. And someone looked at green tea catechin, so again an antioxidant, and found improved muscle metabolism, but very small numbers in that group. So overall, the same limitations for these studies, in that small numbers. You know, we really need to do a bigger trial, but it's very expensive to do big trials. So we need these smaller studies to pave the way. So we know what we need to look at in bigger trials. So more recently, in 2017, there was a systematic review on diet and supplements. This is a very broad systematic review. They looked at risk of onset as well as disease progression. They included nearly all the studies. This is the one I mentioned that included the observational studies. And they looked at trials studies from the last decade. And they found 47 articles, which is actually very small for a whole decade of research. So not many articles really overall. And what they found was that a higher vitamin D status was linked with reduced risk of MS, risk of relapse and lesions. And of course, it's fairly recommended these days by neurologists that people with MS do take vitamin D supplements. Also interesting was higher serum B12 was linked with lower degree of disability, and we know that B12 is important for brain health. But the main message, again, as with all these other studies, is that more research is needed. We don't have a lot of evidence overall in MS as we do for other chronic diseases and diet. Now, this review was just published late last year, another Cochrane review, so very rigorous, very high quality, on vitamin D supplements. And they looked specifically at randomized controlled trials. They found 12. Interestingly, they found no effect on relapse, no effect on disability or MRI lesions. Unclear effects on quality of life and fatigue. So some studies would have found a benefit, possibly others not. But small numbers overall, only 933 people across 12 trials. And the authors were very insistent in highlighting the fact that the evidence was pretty low quality overall. They had low confidence in the results. So please don't use this study as a means to say to people not to take the vitamin D supplements. It's still really important that they do, because we don't have the evidence that they shouldn't. The systematic review did say that the vitamin D supplementation was safe. So definitely keep taking the vitamin D supplements for people with MS. And the authors pointed out that there are 7 ongoing studies that will help provide further evidence around this. Also published last year at a similar time, late last year, was a review on diet and fatigue. Now, this one only looked at food. They didn't look at supplements at all, and they were only interested in fatigue as an outcome. They found 4 intervention studies, again, low numbers overall. There was 146 across those 4 studies, some of them quite short duration, like 3 months. One was a very low-fat diet. One was the McDougall diet, low-fat vegan, and 2 were the paleo diet from Terry Wall's group. One of the paleo studies was multimodal, so it included exercise and meditation. So it's hard to say what was, what would the benefit of diet was in those multimodal studies, but one of them was just the paleo diet. So overall, they found that the low-fat vegan, the McDougall diet, or the paleo diet, both of them improved fatigue, whereas the very low-fat diet worsened fatigue. But again, they couldn't draw any solid conclusions based on the small number of studies. They did indicate that magnesium and folate intake might be important for lower fatigue, and that was based on the fact that the McDougall and paleo diet are very high in green leafy veggies and all the types of veggies that provide those 2 nutrients. And also from other research showing that those nutrients are important for reducing fatigue in other conditions, not necessarily in MS. So that is actually pretty much the limit of the evidence we have now around diet and MS, but there's loads going on now. So researchers, they report their trials on clinicaltrials.gov, a website. So they would list them there when they first start the trial. And when I looked last year for diet and MS, there were more than 60 trials listed across the world, so lots going on. And these are the types of things that are being looked at, a whole range of things. So it's going to be interesting in the next few years to start seeing the results of these studies, particularly for things like gut microbiome, lipoic acid, fish oil, things that have been hinted at might be beneficial. Terry Wall's is also running a much larger trial at the moment in the US, comparing the paleo diet with the swank diet in terms of fatigue and possibly disease progression as well. So it'd be very interesting to see the outcome of that. So unless there's any questions about that section on evidence, I'll move on to talk about what you can tell people now about their diet. What are the best available evidence? What's the best available evidence we have?
No questions at the moment.
Great, thank you, Nicola. Okay, so it sounds very boring, I know, but really these are the best guidelines we have for both people with MS and the general population. It's the Australian Dietary Guidelines. And as I mentioned, only about 4% of people follow these guidelines. Most people would be making a radical change in their diet if they started following these guidelines. If you look at the bottom there of the poster, only sometimes in small amounts, all the discretionary foods, alcohol, soft drinks, things like that, that's what people really eat a lot of. In fact, those foods are providing around 30% of our energy when it really needs to be less than 10%. So we're eating way too much of those foods. And all the special diets agree that we shouldn't be eating those foods, at least we should be reducing those foods. So that's a big change for most people already. And of course, we need to eat more veggies and fruit. I would also say oily fish is important a couple of times a week, which is again something as a population we don't do very well. And there's loads of resources available. If you go to this website, there's one of the pages you can order these resources and they will be sent to you for free. The middle one there is a brochure, Healthy Eating for Adults. It's a very handy brochure to have around if people ask you about diets. And there's posters and there's A4 handouts as well. Very nice quality handouts for people. Great resources to have around for people who do ask you about diet. There are also excellent resources on the National MS Society from the USA. Now, Denise Novak, who's pictured there, she's a dietitian and she worked for 10 years in California for the MS Society. So she brought loads of resources to the MS Society. The picture of her there is from a video. It's available from their website or on YouTube. If you Google her, it's about 8 minutes long. And she talks about just general tips for people to deal with certain symptoms they might be having. They're all based on general healthy eating guidelines, which I've discussed, not necessarily supporting any special diet for MS. And the two pictures on the other side are of PDF booklets that people can download. One is on food, one is on supplements. And again, just going over these things in relation to MS, so specifically for people with MS. And if people are really interested, there's the Healthy Eating Quiz, which is it's been developed at the University of Newcastle. People can take this quiz for free. It takes about 10 or 15 minutes, and they will get a nice report on how they're going with their diet and suggestions on how they might improve their diet. So it's these kind of resources we want to be promoting for people with MS, just to make sure that they're not only relying on the kind of information that comes up in the Google search that might not be evidence-based, because all the things I've been showing you in resources here are based on evidence. Okay, so a quick summary. Overall, if people ask you about the special diets, you can say with confidence that there's very little evidence to support a special diet, but there's ongoing research, and it's really become a topic of interest over the last few years. So we will get some much better and higher quality research over the next few years, which will help with these kinds of recommendations. But we should be encouraging a healthy diet. It does look like diet might be having some impact both on risk of MS and for disease progression. And if people are confused about what is a healthy diet, then I've mentioned some resources that you can point them towards. And we're basically suggesting the Australian Dietary Guidelines is the best evidence we have for everybody, people with MS and the general population. So there's some exciting things happening at the moment in this field. MS Research Australia have formed a working group of national researchers and stakeholders who are looking at modifiable lifestyle factors for MS. Diet is one of those. And the idea of this working group is that we develop some documents, one for health professionals and one for people with MS, to describe the evidence that is existing at the moment for these factors. So that'll include diet. So we should have some documents over the next couple of years that are designed specifically for people with MS. We certainly need more high quality interventions. As you've seen, most of the research so far says more research is needed. We need high quality interventions, and some of these are happening now. The supplementation study I mentioned in Australia, there's the Swank and Paleo clinical trial in America, and all those trials you saw listed on clinicaltrials.gov. Some of them undoubtedly will be very high quality, and we'll get some good results from those. And Rebecca Russell, who I mentioned is doing a PhD here, she is designing a dietary education program specifically for people with MS. So it will address all the types of questions that people with MS are asking. Undoubtedly will address the special diet, since that's a question that comes up a lot. Now, I've put her email address there because she is forming a stakeholder reference group at the moment, and that group will help with the decision making around what to include in the education program, and afterwards how the program went, how it could be improved. So I've put her email address there because she's still looking for some people. She is looking for an MS nurse, she's looking for an occupational therapist, a speechy, and one other, a physio, that's right. So she already has some dietitians on board, she has some people with MS on board, she has a neurologist, and what that will involve is just 2 meetings this year, and it will be by teleconference, of course, if you're over East, and 1 meeting next year and 1 meeting the year after, just an hour-long meeting, similar to what we're doing here, probably a webinar. So if anyone's interested, please do email Rebecca, and her email will be in your handout as well. She would love to hear from you. So just to finish off, I'm so grateful to MSWA for funding my fellowship for the past 3 years. Prior to that, I was not able to focus full-time on MS, and I've been able to do so now for the past 3 years, which is very exciting. And I've been awarded an MS Research Australia fellowship for the next 2 years, and that will be looking at diet and early disease progression, using the follow-up studies from the Ozamine study and the MS Sunshine study. So I'll be able to look at things like the Mediterranean diet and the healthy dietary pattern in terms of early disease progression. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I hope it was helpful. And if anyone does want to email me, I didn't put my email address there, but you can Google me at Curtin, and I'm happy to have a chat with anyone by email or even a phone call if anyone's interested in talking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. I have got a couple of questions, if you don't mind me asking.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, so I've got one from Susan. Flaxseed or fish oils, which one is better?
Okay, so that's a good question. Basically, the fish oil contains the form of omega-3 that our body needs. It's the active form of omega-3, which would be EPA, DHA, and DPA. Flaxseed, on the other hand, doesn't contain those active forms. It contains the parent compound ALA. Now, ALA is converted to the active form in our body, but very small amounts are converted only. So around 3% is converted to the active form. So if you have flaxseed, like 1 gram of flaxseed, you're getting very, very small amounts of the active form. So really the best bet for the omega-3 is the fish oil, oily fish. Even meat has some omega-3, not a lot, but they would be better for our body than the flaxseed.
Okay, great, thank you. And preferred sources of oily fish, given the farmed fish controversy, what would your recommendation be? And that was from Jane.
Well, yeah, that's a very good question as well, because I mean, my background in nutrition is vitamin D. Oily fish has been always considered a very good source of vitamin D, but the farmed fish we think has much lower vitamin D, probably the same for omega-3, so it is difficult. I think the main thing, or the other problem we have with the oily fish is obviously content of toxins like mercury from the sea. So I think the best bet is to choose the smaller oily fish over the larger. So I would be, and choose a variety of fish. And tin fish is fine. Tin fish will still contain the vitamin D and the omega-3. So I would be looking at things like sardines and mackerel, the smaller fish. Salmon as well is fine. Tuna is okay, but because it's a bigger fish, it may contain more of the mercury. So just try and get a variety of fish. But we're not sure, you know, in terms of the farmed fish versus the wild fish, about the nutrient contents at this stage. Certainly we don't know about the vitamin D. It's something we're looking into at the moment. But I think I think just including the oily fish in your diet, even if it's farmed, is still a good thing to do.
Great, thanks, Lucinda. One last question from Kathy is tips for a healthy gut microbiota. I'm assuming that's your fermented foods.
Yeah, so I mean, the gut microbiome, that's a huge area and not at all my area. So I can't comment very authoritatively on that. But I would say the important things are the fiber, certainly, like you mentioned, the fermented foods, and also the fiber. There's certain diets that are promoted for gut health that I forget the name of the diet I'm thinking of, but there's certain diets that are promoted for good gut health. But certainly the high fiber type things. But I'm not an expert per se in the gut microbiome, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you so much, Lucinda. Really getting lots of comments from people about how wonderful and clear the presentation has been. So a big thank you. I'm just going to take the control back over onto my screen, just so I can finish off with a few housekeeping slides.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Lucinda, much appreciated. Okay, so I just want to cover very quickly the services from MSL. So we're here to support your clients. We have a lot of education available, both live webinars, recorded webinars on our webinar library, community days, wellness lunches. We provide employment support. We provide peer support and connection. We provide nurses through our MS Connect gateway, which I'll provide you the number later. Your clients can speak, and you can also speak to nurse advisors and continence nurses, social workers, etc. And we're also involved through MSRA with research. You can look up on the web link provided here, the MS Practice, their online education booklets on a variety of topics. We are also a registered NDIS provider, providing different services for your clients in each of the different 4 states that we cover. Doing a lot of work also in pre-planning for people as they prepare for their NDIS appointments. We have ebooks available, and on your handouts and on the slide here you can see your username and login that you can use to get access to the ebooks. We also have a MS shop. If you go to ms.org.au, you can purchase recorded webinars in a variety of topic areas. And finally, our gateway to our services is via MS Connect on 1800 042 138 or via the MS Connect at ms.org.au email. So thank you very much for your support and for your time today. I know it's been a really interesting and information-packed webinar. Our next webinar coming up in early May is managing clients' behaviours of concern. We've also got motivational interviewing, fatigue, cognition, etc., all coming in following months. So we look forward to seeing you online again soon. Thanks for your time today.